Welcome back to my channel. It's recently come to my attention that a lot of you haven't yet subscribed. Please consider smashing that like button. It really helps the channel in ways that I don't even understand. We're going to start. This is a drawing by Carracci. We're beginning with a placeholder for the head, and I'm going to do a little bit of annotation so you can see the way I'm thinking about this. So here's what I've just drawn. You'll notice that the line of the shoulders kind of crosses over the bottom of the chin, but the most important gestural line that we're looking for right now is this beautiful S-curve for the spine. You see that? So let's go ahead and try to put that in. We're going to start towards the back of the head, and we're curving around the rib cage slightly to the right. Notice that the direction of the curve changes about one head unit down. So we're about one head unit down. The direction of the curve changes, it straightens out, and it curves the other way for the last unit. So the top of the rib cage is here. This is not the rib cage, that's the shoulder blade. This is sort of the form of the rib cage. The rib cage is turned slightly. We're seeing a little bit of the left side of the rib cage. So we're going to try to place this rib cage. This curvature here is caused by the vertebrae curving around the egg shape of the rib cage. So we sort of end up with that as our second volume. And then, as usual, we find this that this lower volume is kicking back a little. So this is tilted forward, and then this is tilting a little bit back. Sort of like that. Keep your lines very loose and light and flowing right now. We have not committed to anything yet. So the ball of the shoulder over here is, notice that the shoulders fall along this angle, which is about 35 degrees or so from horizontal. So I'm going to give myself that angle, and that's going to help me place the ball of this shoulder here and the ball of this shoulder, which drops way down below it. And these are the deltoid muscles, the main muscle that sort of caps your shoulder blade, or your shoulder joint, I should say. And now I'm going to look for the angles of the limbs, and this is a little shallower than the angle of the shoulders, and that limb is very foreshortened. I'm going to picture swinging this around, and I'm comparing its length to the length of the rib cage. It's quite a bit shorter than the rib cage. This is foreshortened. It's moving slightly away from us. And then this angle here is really just about parallel to the angle of the shoulders. So this is about horizontal, and then we're going to resume that same. And that's partly what makes the drawing so beautiful and harmonious, is the repetition of certain angles like that. And the hand flows nicely off of the end here of the wrist. There's a little cropping there, so we won't be able to see all those details, but I'm indicating very schematically kind of what this gesture is. And now on this side, we're going to look for this angle. And that is about maybe 15 degrees from vertical. I'm going to carry this around to check the length, and it intersects with this point, which is about one head from the seat. So that brings us to about here. And now we have another repetition of this same angle. This is sort of the dominant movement in this drawing is along this axis, and it's very foreshortened, so we're going to just indicate that the hand is happening right about here. And we're going to continue this kind of stick figure thinking. There's the indentation of the greater trochanter, and the femur is running at about 45 degrees. So we're going to locate that joint and carry the femur down. And as always, we're going to work from what we've determined to what we haven't determined. So I'm going to visually check for myself the relationship between these two joints. And I can see that they're pretty much directly, the elbow joint and the knee joint are right on top of each other. So that's going to help me place the knee correctly. That's something that you just have to train yourself to do. Biggest error most beginners make in the figure is they just relate things to their neighbors instead of thinking of relating them to things that are a little further away. So this angle is very close. Again, see, it's parallel to our main direction of the shoulders. And this limb ends, the ankle is directly under the termination of the spine here. So we know where to put that. And then the angle of the foot is slightly steeper. And then even the bottom of the foot, though, is continuing this main direction. And I can double check this angle from the hand to the toes and make sure that it's going to help me get both of them in the right place. Like that. So take a look at all your relationships here. Make sure everything kind of fits together. You can take a peek at, like, see this negative space created in here. Make sure that's about the same size and shape in your drawing. But we're going to quickly move on to adding some masses to these forms. And we're going to do that by starting with blocking them in. So as we've discussed before, it can be helpful to look for indentations opposite most of the projections that we find in the figure. So let's take a quick look at this arm. We have a projection here, and we have an indentation opposite. Here we have this projection and this indentation sort of corresponds to this projection. Here we have another projection. It's not an easy formula, but you definitely, what we've talked about, you want to avoid is doing this and putting your indentations directly opposite each other. So let's go ahead and try to block this in. And can I get closer? Yeah, so there's our deltoid muscle. Here's a little bit of the bicep showing. And this indentation happens before the elbow joint. And then we've got the muscles of the forearm, this group, and then tapering to the wrist. Make sure you make this wide enough. Way down here, we're going to come out. We've got a bulge here for the tricep muscle, an indent right before we get to the elbow joint, a slight bulge at the elbow joint, and then this slight bulge of forearm muscles tapering to the wrist. I'm drawing this a little dark so you can see what I'm doing. Try not to do it even as dark as I'm doing it, because we want this to be kind of subtle. So notice that the deltoid muscle ends a little bit to the right of the armpit here, and then it goes into this little reveal of the trapezius, and that flows into the back of the neck. And returning back to the wrist, notice this little curve. It's very valuable for indicating that that we're seeing the end of the wrist. It's like the top of a cylinder. It sort of explains some of the foreshortening we're seeing in the arm. And I'm going to invent a little bit of this hand because I can't see it. I'm just going to draw that finger. And notice that little flip outward of the last joint of the thumb. Gives it a very natural, graceful look that you don't often see exactly that on the living figure, but you see it a lot in drawings. So as long as we're zoomed in here, I don't usually approach it this way, but we're just going to commit to this arm and go ahead and do some shading. So I'm going to shadow map first. Here's this muscle, this bottom edge of the deltoid muscle. And here's the shadow under the trapezius. And then there's a boundary here, this little accent, this division of the forearm muscles, and a little bit of shading along the bottom of the hand. And instead of doing first shading, which we don't really see in this drawing, we're just going to follow exactly what Carracci did and use these little curved hatch marks to show these forms. It's important to recognize that when you're drawing from a photograph or even from a live model, you're getting no direction at all for what should I be doing with my hand right now. But when you copy a masterpiece like this, you're training your hand to make some of these moves that you would really have no idea to do if you weren't looking at the drawing. And after a while, they become very natural, and you don't have to think about it so much. So there does seem to be a little bit of smudging in this drawing, so if you want to you can drag your finger lightly through this if you want, and then just go a little darker through the core shadow, and that's what it's going to take to give us a sense of that reflected light bouncing up into the bottom of the arm. Okay, we're going to back out again a little bit and focus on the torso now. So here, as I said, this is the scapula or shoulder blade, and the shoulder blade muscles are creating this bulge. The shoulder blade is rotated slightly. It's always good to kind of think about what that bone is doing. It's the most mobile bone in the body because it's basically floating there on the rib cage. There's no joint between the rib cage and any other bone. I mean, between the shoulder blade and any other bone. I remember when I was first learning human anatomy, the thing that really took me by surprise was that the only connection that the shoulder blade has to the rest of your skeleton that's not a muscle connection is at the pit of your neck. And I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but you go from the pit of your neck to your clavicle, collarbone, and you can feel that when you move your shoulder up and down, you can feel the clavicle moving up and down. So this is the connection. This right here is the only connection between your rib cage and your arm. It's kind of interesting to consider. So now we get down here. This is the rib cage itself kind of pushing out. And then here we have the external oblique muscle. And then somewhere around here, I don't see it indicated, but this is where the iliac crest would be. And we're just going to flow from here right down into this the thigh. These are those powerful muscles in the front of your thigh. There's always a lot of thickness between the femur and this outside margin. So we're gonna make that nice and full. And we'll do the rest of the leg later, but now the position of the pelvis is clearly visible mainly through these landmarks. This area is called the sacral triangle. The sacrum is it's like your tailbone, which is here, and then these points are the back projection of the iliac spine. So you've got this iliac crest curving up and around, and it terminates at these 2 points, which show up in on the body as indentations. And we've talked about this before. When you see an indentation on the living form, it generally indicates a projection on the skeleton, because projections are places where muscles attach, and where the muscles attach is where they get the thinnest. We can see that opposite this indentation, we've got this bulge right here. And I'm sort of, I might have placed these points a little too high. They're more directly, no, they're a little bit above that's the trochanter of the femur. I think that's right about here. Let me draw that. I think this indentation is trochanter of the femur, which should be below these points. So I think we're in pretty good shape with that. So this distance, it would be good to measure, and I'm going to say that's about a head height. Let's see. Yeah, that's about one head. So if we know the size of the head, we can get to there. And notice this little indentation right here. Okay, so be sure you come in far enough right here. This is sort of the top of the iliac on this side, and then there's this little bulge of the external oblique, and then we go into this compressed section of rib cage, and then the shoulder blade on this side. And the general idea here is that on this side of the torso, everything is pulled apart, and on this side, everything is compressed. So you have to fight your impulse to make this too symmetrical, and really just can you feel how these movements are all really pulled apart and these movements are all really scrunched up together? And I'm going to check my work, and what I'm checking is the level of this little fork of skin right here compared to the other side, and it's sort of around the top of the cresting of this rib cage. So I'm going to go straight across, and you do the same thing. Make sure that this little fork of skin compression is directly across from there. And I'm going to raise this shoulder just a little bit, which is about how much I raised it on the other side. And this is a time when I might be looking at a negative space, and everyone should know what that means by now. This is like the space that's formed where all these form around all these forms, in between the forms. You see that shape, this shape right here? You want to make sure that this shape corresponds to the shape in the original drawing. We're just assessing that as an abstract form, not an anatomical form. There's our bicep, our elbow, and remember we already marked where the wrist on this side is going to go. We created that. Well, we marked where the fingers end. So we can go back to that mark and do this slight undulation like that. And let's do some shadow mapping over here. And here we are seeing, I would say, a right-handed first shading. You see how the general flow of this drawing is this direction? So I'm going to shade backhand so I can do this with my left hand, but if you're right-handed, just this will be easier. And you'll notice that he is, even with his first shading direction, he's starting to curve around this forearm a little bit. We'll shade the back after we do the face. Here's the trapezius on this side. And the tough thing here, we already know that this is the head, but there's this very slight indentation about a little more than, well, let's take a measurement here. So we've got the bottom of the head is about here, the eye is about here, and the top of the skull is about here. So it's less than halfway from here to here. We have this little indentation where the eye is, and then we're going to curve into the forehead, and there's a little bit of the nose showing sort of like that. I might even have the eye just a little too high there because I'm reading my drawing. It looks like she's looking slightly more downward in the original. So that feels a little better. This side of her head is in shadow, so I'm going to do that. This is called a lost profile. It's pretty challenging to get it to look right. And the hair is all in a, it's coming pretty far off the top of the skull, obviously, so we're just going to freehand that in. So you'll notice in my drawing her nose looks enormous, but the difference between enormous and normal is about a 32nd of an inch. In that lost profile, it's really easy to get something off. And here's this ear, which is way up above the eye level, which helps show how far down her head is tipped. And a little first shading and smudging on this side of the head is going to make that hair kind of turn. Okay, we're going to get into shading the torso now. This is really the most complicated part of the drawing. There's a little... Well, let's start with the big shadow shapes. So we've got this shape on the right side of this shoulder blade, kind of bifurcates and follows the curve of the back down to here, and then it sort of trails off right above this dimple and then hooks around and follows the gluteal muscles and curves around like that. So this is our main shadow shape. We'll go ahead and do a first shading here so it starts to stand out and make sense. Notice we're kind of working outside in on this drawing. Like I start with the contours and now we're adding the shading. Sometimes I prefer to do a little more shading before I nail down the contours, but so we're going to clean up some of the construction lines. So see what that does? Like all of a sudden now we can really read the main volume of the torso. Here we have this indentation. We're just a little bit of actual shadow there, but most of this is halftone. So you want to press very lightly when you draw that. Never let your halftones compete with your shadows. Again, another little piece of shadow right there, but mostly what we have going on this side to the left of the spine is half tones, which we're going to handle with much lighter pressure. There's a half tone over here under the rib cage, above the external oblique. And these, you can think of these as two big columns of muscle on either side of the spine. Here, this should be familiar from drawing spheres. We've got reflected light. So we're going to go a little darker in our core shadow here and leave a little darker on our cast shadow and leave that little reflected light sort of glowing in between. And more subtly on the other side, but it's still the same sort of thing. First shading, and then a little bit of contour shading that through the core shadow with a little hint of reflected light coming through. Okay, so we still have to block in this leg. And you're used to thinking of legs as being a lot longer than they are wide, but let's just consider this for a second. This dimension here compared to this dimension, it's definitely, this is roughly the length of the femur. It's surprisingly wide, right? So like it's maybe twice as long as it is wide. So this is about twice that. You just want to get a feel for the proportions before you draw the shape. There's a lot of compression going on here. That's partly where the width is coming from. It wouldn't appear that wide in a standing figure. And here's this calf muscle. Remember the tibia lays sort of along the front of the leg, and the musculature of the bottom of the lower leg is up and behind it. Here's that little undercut at the bottom of the kneecap. And then notice that the front of the tibia is almost straight. And that this distance here is, again, surprisingly wide. Maybe not quite as wide as I drew it. And the foot. You look at your own feet every day, and so you think you know what feet look like, but you really don't, because they appear so differently from different angles. So it's helpful to, and they usually look nothing the way they look from your head looking at your own feet. So it can be really helpful to just block something like this in as a simple geometric shape first, and then gradually refine it. You see I'm going to cut out this little piece on the sole of the foot, and I'm going to cut out the toes with this curved line, and then pop those in. And there's obviously a shadow along the entire sole of the foot. I'm going to switch to Carracci's first shading direction again. And we end up with something like that. A little shadow accent under the ankle. And there's a slight plane change here at the top of the thigh. Here's the shadow shape on the bottom edge of the thigh. Contour shading. I want you all to just pause and appreciate for a second. Every time there's a skin fold in this drawing, Carracci's showing us a very clear forking of the fold. There's a bifurcation here of the, and that's not always very clear on a living figure unless you're looking for it, but it's an effect that he is, I would say, definitely exaggerated for the sake of clarity. So it looks really ugly if you end a skin fold in a single line. And there's just a little bit of a shadow along the bottom edge of the tibia. And if you're wondering why that's so light, it's because it's close to the ground. So those forms close to the ground just get the most reflected light. There's also a lot of reflected light here at the bottom of the thigh because there's light bouncing off of the calf. It can be helpful to think through why you're seeing some of these light effects that you're seeing. So here's that horizontal shading that I always teach you to do on the ground plane. Done kind of haphazardly here. This is obviously a fairly quick study. And we can be a lot more casual about these details of the fabric because that's kind of random structurally, and if we get it wrong, nobody's gonna complain too loudly about it. In fact, I'm switching back to my lefty shading for these big areas of dark. So at this point, I'm going to just back out a little and get some distance from the drawing. Check my proportions. Feels like I need to trim a tiny bit off of the bottom of the knee here. I really missed this kind of overlap of the lower leg sort of coming up under the kneecap. You'll be seeing different things in your drawing, but this is a good time to step back a foot or two away from your drawing and see what sort of changes would most benefit it. Carracci is doing this kind of interesting shading thing along this contour, which I'm going to try to emulate. And I know I'm going a little fast right now. Don't feel like you need to add in all these background elements. If you're still working on the figure, that's fine. So at this stage in my drawing, I'm trying to balance my main darks. So I'm squinting a little and looking at my drawing, and I just want the same darks to kind of pop out of my drawing that pop out in the original. So I'm seeing I could go darker through the torso. This core shading on the torso. Darker right here on the seat. Definitely a lot darker on the face. And this is really the ultimate challenge, is to try to copy a drawing that's this beautiful and make your drawing look even a little bit close to being as good. Some of the qualities of this drawing are very hard to capture, so don't beat yourself up if you feel like you're falling a little short. And if you have time, there's this mysterious second figure. What even is that? I don't know if this figure is part of the composition or if it's just, could be that he just had already started something on this paper and then he decided to do this other study. But I'm going to throw this guy in there. Okay, I think that's about as far as I'm going to go on this. So if you're watching at home, thank you, and I will see you next time. If you're here, I'm going to be helping you in a second.